Hey there, Rednecks, Preppies, Redneck Preppies. It's me, the Redneck Preppy. How you doing today? Great, good. Today, in the latest episode of the A Short and Convoluted History series, we're going to take a look at Japan's primary service rifle of the First World War, the Type 38 Arisaka, though as we shall see, it saw more use in the Second World War. As always, these episodes are meant to be a brief introduction to the subject matter, not an exhaustive exploration. Now, just to address naming right away, the rifle was known as the Type 38 as it was accepted in the 38th year of the Meiji period. That corresponds to 1905 in the Western calendar, so you could refer to this rifle as the M1905 Arisaka, though I've never heard anyone actually do so. Let's take a brief look at today's subject. The old joke was that everything in modern Japan is miniature, thanks to their technological innovations. If you're old enough, you will remember jokes about Japanese transistor radios. But the Type 38 Arisaka is very much of the old world. Comes in at a length of 50.2 inches or 1.275 meters and a barrel length of 31.5 inches or 80 centimeters. The rifle is 9.1 pounds or 4.12 kilograms in weight and features, as many rifles of the day, a 5-round fixed internal staggered magazine. It is chambered in the 6.5 by 50 millimeter cartridge, or 6.5 Jap as it used to be called, a cartridge that I have always felt didn't get the respect that it deserved. The rear sights are graduated from 400 meters to an optimistic 2400 meters, though there are rifles that above a certain serial number range are graduated to 2200 yards. Now, these could either be notch sights, or as this one is a peep sight. Again, it depends on when the rifle was manufactured. There can be a lot of subtle variations with Type 38s, including the sights. At the front, we have your standard cleaning rod and a lug for the bayonet. Here is the bayonet. This one is a reproduction. Real ones cost a pretty penny when you can actually find them. The front sight is a barley corn style with 2 protective wings. As you may be able to see from our closer look at the Type 38, it was obviously influenced by Mauser designs at the time, specifically the Gewehr 98. Hey, look, that's familiar, huh? Hey, pretend that this is a safety flag and not a safety knob. Same darn thing. But this also does have some unique features, which I'll go over later. Until the second half of the 1890s, the Japanese Army had been utilizing the Murata rifle, the country's first indigenously produced service arm. Now, the Type 13, as it was also known as, was a single shot, firing the very late 18th century 11 by 60 millimeter rimmed cartridge. Now, of course, if you know your firearms history, the late 18th century was not a good time to be carrying a rifle that had no magazine and fired a large, slow bullet. Even the introduction of a version with a magazine, the Type 22, didn't really help that much. So in 1895, the Japanese began working on its replacement, a rifle that would feature an internal magazine and a svelte new round. Under the direction of Colonel Arisaka Nariakira and Tokyo's Kyoshikawa Arsenal, Japan came up with what would be known as the Type 30 rifle, chambered in 6.5 by 50 millimeter, semi-rimmed. The rifle was adopted in 1897 for what would be undoubtedly a long service history. Well, except not. Nothing reveals a weapon's weaknesses like war, and the 1904-1905 conflict against Russia showed that the Type 30 had some issues, notably with reliability and safety. It has small problems like cartridges bursting during firing, accumulating unburnt gunpowder in parts of the breech, which could cause the face of a soldier to be burnt upon its ignition. Yeah, that and jamming, misfires, and extraction issues. So Major Kijiro Nambu, a man who some have dubbed the John Browning of Japan, was tasked to redesign the Type 30. And the first result was the Type 35 in 1902, a rifle that was expressly designed for the Navy, and with only 38,000 produced. Now, it obviously didn't last long, but it did serve as kind of like an interim rifle with a few features such as a larger cocking knob and a sliding dust cover, which would surface in the next rifle. And so he went back to work in 1905, and in the following year, he unveiled the new rifle, one that would go down in history as the Type 38 Arisaka. He had made a number of changes, which included simplifying the bolt design, aiding both in its manufacture and maintenance, and an obvious addition to the infantry's rifle, because remember this was only on the Navy rifle, was the addition of a dust cover. An obvious question by many is, why does the Type 38 have the Arisaka name, despite the fact that Arisaka Akita had little to do with the redesigned rifle? Well, by the time the Type 38 was unveiled, Arisaka had become head of Japan's Army Technical Bureau, where he headed a committee looking at updating older weapons. Now, I suspect it was a combination of the Type 38 being largely based on his Type 30, the tremendous respect that Nambu had for Arisaka, and perhaps a hat tip to the man who would actually pass judgment on his efforts. Let's take a brief break to explore Kijiro Nambu because he had some pretty impressive accomplishments. Now, Nambu was born on September 22nd, 1869 in what is today the Saga Prefecture to a former samurai retainer of the Nabeshima clan. Nambu's father was not well off despite that lofty status, and he had to send the boy off to a local merchant to be raised. Now, we don't know too much about Nambu's life at this time, but at the age of 20, he was accepted into the Imperial Japanese Army Academy, the officers' training school for the infantry. At 23 in 1892, he graduated as a lieutenant of artillery. Now, 1897 proved to be a momentous year in the career of the young officer when he was assigned to the Tokyo Arsenal to work with Nari Akira Arisaka. Together, they worked on what would become the Type 30 rifle. He was eventually promoted to major and began working on some of his own projects, including a semi-automatic pistol, which would eventually become the Model 14 Nambu pistol. Now, over Nambu's service, he came up with a number of weapons designs, from the aforementioned Nambu family of pistols to light and heavy machine guns, too many, in fact, to get into today. We're here for the Type 38 rifle. Now, as I mentioned earlier, a number of issues were identified with the Type 30 rifle from both a safety and reliability perspective, so after the Russo-Japanese War, Nambu was ordered to make a redesign. In 1922, Nambu was promoted to Lieutenant General and was placed in charge of the Tokyo Arsenal. The following year, he undertook the mission to reorganize the entire arsenal system, and once that task was complete, he retired in 1924. But you can't keep a man of industry idle for very long, and in 1927, he founded Nambu Arms Manufacturing Company. And not surprisingly, his company received a number of contracts to supply weapons for both the Army and the Navy. In 1945, following the end of the Second World War, Nambu's company was essentially taken over by the American occupation authorities and continued to produce weapons for both the domestic police and Japan's National Safety Forces. Nambu passed away on May the 1st, 1949. His company is still around in spirit today, having been taken over by Minibiya Company, a Japanese multinational which produces, among many things, defense-related components for that country's Ministry of Defense. Earlier, I stated that the Type 38 was fairly beholden to the Mauser design, but that doesn't mean that it's a mere clone. Nambu and the Japanese did bake in some interesting features. And the most obvious unique feature is, you guessed it, the buttstock. Of all military rifles produced, the Arisaka was unique in that its buttstock was not a single piece of wood, but rather two pieces that are dovetailed and glued together. Now, if you know anything about Japan, you know that's an island of which much is farmland or mountain. So to make best use of resources, the Japanese went to a two-piece stock, which allowed them to use smaller stock blanks. According to Duncan McCollum, this also had the added benefit of strengthening the toe of the buttstock because the grain of the lower piece ran parallel to the bottom edge of the buttstock. Okay, obviously the most notable feature of the Type 38 was its dust cover. And in response to the Type 30's performance during the Russo-Japanese War, the dust cover fits into two grooves machined into the receiver along the sides and covers the entire action when the bolt is closed. And there's one of the machined grooves on this side. Now, you've undoubtedly heard that Japanese soldiers, fearing detection, thanks to the clunky noise that this can produce, as you're hearing right now, removed and tossed the dust cover. Now, I do address that in a video I released a few years ago, a link in the description and in the top corner, but the short version is, I don't really buy it. When the rifles were new and everything was serial matched, okay, the dust cover was tight and didn't really make this same noise. Finally, another attention grabber is the 16-petal chrysanthemum, or mum as most refer to it, which was the symbol of the Japanese emperor. It essentially denotes that the rifle is the personal property of the emperor Hirohito at the time. Now, mum isn't unique to the Type 38. It did appear on weapons both before and after the Type 38. At any rate, I have a whole video devoted to the topic of mums, which you can find in the description and in a link at the top corner. Nambu's redesigned rifle went into immediate production at the Tokyo Arsenal starting in 1906, and by 1932, just over 2 million were produced there. Eventually, a total of 3 million rifles were produced at various arsenals until 1942, when production finally ended. However, let's not get ahead of ourselves, as plenty happened before 1942. The beginning of World War II is traditionally dated to September the 1st, 1939, with the German invasion of Poland, but I would submit that that's a Eurocentric take. The Chinese could justifiably argue that the first shots actually took place on September 18th, 1931, when the Japanese staged a false flag incident to justify an invasion of Manchuria, or July the 7th, 1937, when all-out war exploded between the two countries. Now, it was during this war that the Type 38, known as Sanpichi-ju to the soldiers, received its first real baptism by fire, as World War I for Japan was largely a naval affair. And it was in China that the Japanese noticed a few problems with the rifle. It was, for a start, very long, given that the average height of a Japanese soldier was about 5 feet 5 inches. The rifle came in at about 4.1 feet. Now, I don't know if this is apocryphal, but many Japanese soldiers reportedly had difficulty reaching the bolt when the rifle was shouldered. and at 9 pounds, not the lightest thing to carry for a smaller man. More troubling, however, were reports from the field that the rifle's cartridge didn't have the stopping power of the enemy's Gewehr 88 rifles with its 8mm Mauser cartridge. Japanese soldiers claimed that Chinese soldiers shot during battle had the uncomfortable habit of not dying as readily as the Japanese army would have preferred and continued to fight. Of course, the rifle's length wasn't a complete negative. Japanese army doctrine prized hand-to-hand combat and the rifle with bayonet, and that latter alone measured 20 inches, made it a fairly effective close-quarters weapon. They also found that it was a very durable rifle with an action that could probably withstand more pressure than could be reasonably produced by the 6.5 Arisaka round. Following the war, testing determined that the rifle's locking action was probably the strongest of any rifle during the Second World War. And another positive was that the Japanese soldiers quite appreciated the dust cover, which did a good job of keeping out the rain, dirt, and mud of China. It would have been really interesting to see how well the Type 38 would have functioned in the muddy trench warfare of World War I. Not an impossibility, given that some of its purchasers were placed to use it in those conditions. The Type 38 did see action throughout the Second World War for the Japanese, but after the introduction of the Type 99 in 1939, the Type 38 was increasingly relegated for duty in China and Southeast Asia, while the Type 99 was most often found in the Pacific Theater. As I've mentioned earlier, the Type 38 was chambered in the 6.5 by 50mm semi-rimmed Arisaka cartridge. The cartridge began its military life in 1897 when it was adopted by the Imperial Japanese Army as the standard Japanese infantry round for their new Type 38 Arisaka rifle and carbine. And it wasn't until 1902 that the Imperial Japanese Navy also adopted that cartridge for their Type 35 rifles. When the cartridge was adopted, formerly known as the Type 30 cartridge, it was a round-nosed bullet. 10 years later, in 1907, the Japanese made the switch to a Spitzer bullet and designated the cartridge as the Type 38. Now, obviously, the cartridge also saw use with today's subject, the Type 38 rifle. There are a few advantages that lay with the 6.5 Arisaka cartridge. Combined with a rifle that has some heft to it, it doesn't actually have much recoil. And if you've ever fired a Type 38, you'll probably remember that it's not exactly a shoulder bruiser. And shooters of 6.5mm based rounds today know what 6.5mm shooters back then knew. It's a relatively flat shooting round. That, at least in theory, makes it easier for a shooter to be more accurate. But with the good comes the alleged bad. Compared to world destroyers like the 30-06 or 303 British, as I stated earlier, the 6.5 Arisaka was perceived as not being as powerful. Reminiscent of accounts Americans would tell a few decades later concerning the 30 carbine round against Chinese soldiers in Korea, Japanese soldiers during the war in China swore up and down that they would shoot Chinese soldiers, but that round just wasn't powerful enough to kill their foe. Personally, I'm a little doubtful that a 140 grain bullet traveling at about 2,500 feet per second and imparting nearly 2,000 foot-pounds of energy on its unlikely target would be all that less lethal than some other rounds. But the Japanese felt strongly enough about the matter that they replaced the round in 1939 with the 7.7 by 58mm Arisaka round for their new Type 99 rifles. Now, as the Type 38 rifle continued service until the end of the Second World War, the 6.5mm Arisaka was knocked down to a secondary role, but it didn't really go anywhere. At this time in military history, where there is a full-length rifle, there also tends to be a cavalry version as well, and the Type 38 was no exception. We're not exactly sure when they started manufacturing the Type 38 carbine, only that it started after the rifle itself. The carbine was to replace the Type 30 carbine and be issued to mounted troops and others who would benefit from a handier rifle, people like engineers. Now, how many were produced is subject to a little bit of debate, as I've seen numbers ranging from about 543,000 to about 603,000. Production primarily took place at the Koishikawa Arsenal in Tokyo and the Nagoya Arsenal in the city of the same name. Now, the primary difference between the rifle and the carbine is obviously scale. The carbine is 38 inches or 97 centimeters in length with a 19-inch or 49 centimeter barrel. It weighs in at 7.3 pounds or 3.3 kilograms. One notable difference between the full-length rifle and the carbine is the carbine lacks a bayonet. There was another version of the rifle that was reportedly for mounted soldiers, which the Japanese produced from 1940 to 1945. It too was a shortened rifle, but instead of new manufacture, it was produced by taking existing Type 38 rifles and converting them. According to Duncan McCollum, we don't have any evidence that the Japanese actually had a special designation for this rifle outside of simply referring to it as short rifle. So when you hear military surplus collectors refer to this as a Type 38 cavalry rifle, know that that's a collector's term. At any rate, Type 38s had the barrel shortened to 25 inches or 63.5 centimeters, which required a new handguard in stock. Shorter barrel also meant a shorter cleaning rod at 23.5 inches. Now, this work left a rifle which resembles a Type 99 in rough profile and size. Now, this work seems to have been carried out exclusively at the Nagoya Arsenal, but we really don't have an idea as to how many, though I have read estimates that as many as 100,000 were produced. There was, of course, a sniper variant, and it was known as the Type 97. Developed in 1937, it essentially was just a Type 38 mated with a 2.5 power scope by Tokia. The Type 97 is one of those projects which kind of seemed fumbled right from the start. Now, in the 10 years that the Japanese worked on a sniper rifle platform, all they ended up to come up with at the end was taking an existing rifle and slapping a scope on it. Now, adding to the rifle's issues was the fact that its long-range accuracy wasn't particularly good. Somewhat of an issue for a sniper rifle. Now, thanks to this rifle not being particularly good, the Japanese actually had to change their sniper doctrine to emphasize camouflage and concealment rather than long-range engagement. Now, I've read that about 14,000 of these rifles were produced. Not surprisingly, it was replaced in 1942 with a sniper rifle based on the Type 99 Arisaka. Wait, there's more. In 1911, the Japanese Army also adopted another carbine, this basically a Type 38, but with a folding bayonet that was permanently attached to the firearm. Now, about 150,000 of the rifles were produced at several arsenals, including Koishikawa, Nagoya, and Kokura. That carbine went through a number of iterations because the first pattern was found to have problems with accuracy, thanks to a barrel shroud, and a weakness in design that could result in the forestock breaking when excessive pressure was applied to the bayonet. Last one, I promise. The Japanese also used a version of the Type 38 that was a hybrid of that rifle and an Italian Carcano. And no, I'm not lying. Designed by Italy's Tierney Royal Arms Factory and supplied to the Japanese Navy in 1938 and 1939, I've read that about 60,000 of these were produced, and one of their distinguishing features is that they don't actually have Japanese markings. That and the Type I used a Model 1891 Carcano-style action on a rifle that otherwise looked like a Type 38. From what I've been told, collectors are apparently not big fans of the Type I because neither Japanese nor Italian rifles have been traditionally a big draw for collectors, which makes me want one even more. I doubt I'm going to shock you with news that the Japanese use the Type 38 rifle, but there were some others that also adopted it to varying degrees, some perhaps a little more surprising than others. Now obviously Britain and Japan were enemies during the Second World War, but you may have forgotten they were actually allies during the First World War. Short of, well, everything, the British in 1914 purchased 150,000 Type 30 and 38 Arisakas from Japan and dubbed them the Pattern 1900 and 1907 rifles. Now, a total of 12 regiments were issued most of the rifles, while the remaining 50,000 were given to the Royal Navy to free up Lee Enfields for the Army. British Allied forces also made use of Type 30s, including the Desert Army under Colonel T.E. Lawrence. Now, as far as I can tell, no British soldiers actually used the rifle in combat. They were mostly used in training and island defense roles, and they were all eventually shipped off to Russia in 1916. Which leads us then to Russian use. Vladimir Fedorov, designer of the Fedorov automat, had initially designed that automatic rifle around the 7.62 by 54 millimeter rimmed round, but he found that it actually pounded the rifle to bits. So instead, he switched to chambering to 6.5 Arisaka. Now, Fedorov wasn't the only firearms designer in Russia to experiment with the 6.5 Arisaka round. The Russians were actually fairly impressed by the cartridge's performance against them during the Russo-Japanese War. Several designs of semi-automatic rifles chambered in that cartridge resulted, though none actually ended up going anywhere. But that's the cartridge, not the rifle. Russian soldiers on the Armenian front were issued the Type 38 carbine. Now, I don't have exact numbers. The politics of that day and the sands of history aren't exactly clear now, but I have read that beginning as early as November 1914, Japan began supplying Russia with rifles, a total of 500,000, some of which apparently were routed to the Caucasus Army. Now, unsurprisingly, around this time, if the Russians were involved in a war, they somehow managed to involve Finland. Some of the Type 30 and 38s that the Russians bought from Japan were warehoused in Finland, and as enterprising Finns raided those stores, starting in 1917, they used them as part of their fight for independence. And after that success, they tried to convert them to 8mm Mauser, but apparently that didn't go very far. Eventually, they bundled up about 2,400 and sent them off to Estonia, where they were converted to .303 British. Now, given that the Type 38s were heavily used by the Japanese in China before and during World War II, no great surprise that the Japanese, both nationalist and communist forces, made extensive use of captured rifles in their fight against the Imperial Japanese Army. And both nationalist and communist forces ended up using them against each other during the Civil War afterwards. Now, there are a number of other countries that utilize the Type 38 Arisaka, whether captured from the Japanese as Filipino guerrillas did, or provided as aid to pro-Japanese collaboration forces and governments across Asia, or just as aid after the war. I'm not sure that you can use the word legacy for the Type 38 Arisaka. There are those that hold it in some regard for its cartridge and the fact that it arguably had one of the strongest bolt actions of any rifle. I haven't actually found any evidence that it influenced firearms other than its immediate successor, the Type 99. It was, at the end of the day, just another rifle that fell from the Mauser tree. And after World War II, it's not like militaries were thinking bolt actions for the future. Now, some people have argued that the Type 38 was one of the finest rifles of World War II, the Japanese bolt-action Garand, as one person, presumably sober, put it. I would take issue with that contention. I could easily name half a dozen rifles that I would prefer to carry instead of the Type 38, and half of those would be from the United States alone. That said, at least for me personally, I do have some affection for it, even if I would have chosen literally almost anything else if I was a soldier fighting in World War II. World War I, though? Maybe. That dust cover. At any rate, I hope you found today's video to at least be vaguely entertaining and mildly informative. As always, I hope you have a fantastic day. Tenno Haika Banzai.